In this lecture module, we're going to turn our attention to translation heuristics. We want to remind ourselves why we're doing that. Our translation heuristics are the least rigorous, rule-bound element of our formal system. However, it's our translation heuristics that are going to allow us to leverage our formal system and our effective decision procedure for maximal return on our intellectual investment. By learning how to formulate a wider variety of sentences and capture a wider breadth of situations in our simplified language in our formal system, we can increase its power without sacrificing its simplicity. Our goal here, what will count as a good translation, is if we take an English sentence that isn't one of our standard form categorical statements and we translate, reformulate that sentence to create an instance, again, just in English, of one of our 4 standard form categorical statements with which we've constructed our formal system. Our final translations then should start with one of the 3 standard form quantifiers, all, no, or some. It should be followed by a subject term that picks out a class of things. And that should be followed by a copula, one of our 2 verb forms, are or are not, that is consistent with the quantifier that we've used. And it should end then with a predicate term that picks out a class of things. And I can't emphasize how important that part is. I want to have every translation, and I can check at the end of my translation, do I have a standard form quantifier? Followed by a subject term that picks out a class of things, followed by a standard form copula, are or are not from my pirate language, and ending with a predicate term that picks out a class of things. If you can get a sentence that has that form, then you're 70-75% of the time going to have a pretty decent translation. The rules that we look at now, the heuristic suggestions for translation that we're going to go through, those are just intended to get us the last little bit of the way. These rules are just going to make sure that we end up with the best standard form categorical statement given the original sentence or the original situation. So let's take a look at an example. Suppose that we have an English sentence where we have terms, but the terms have no nouns or pronouns as part of their phrasing. Suppose, for example, you have all lectures are boring. Now, boring is not a class of things. You don't go to the store to pick up a 6-pack of boring. You don't trade boring futures on the commodities market, and so on. Boring isn't a class of things. So I need to add a noun or a pronoun to that phrase to create a predicate term that is a class of things. So I might just do something like this. All lectures are boring activities. All I need is a noun or a pronoun, preferably a noun, that makes sense in the context of the sentence or the argument. All instructor corrections are annoying. Well, of course, that is absolutely untranslatable. No, wait. All instructor corrections are annoying. When we see annoying there, we should notice that it is just like boring. It is not something that people count or measure out or otherwise exchange with one another. Annoying, therefore, isn't a class of things. And so to translate this sentence, we have to introduce a noun phrase. All instructor corrections are annoying, paternalistic infringements upon my intellectual freedom. Or maybe something more basic, like all instructor corrections are annoying corrections. In short, because my logic is a logic of categories or classes of things, I have to make sure that when I translate, all of my subject and predicate terms in fact pick out classes of things. Here's another example of how I may find myself having difficulties. Singular propositions are propositions that refer to a single individual. Something like this: Ted thinks it's a beautiful day. There's nothing wrong with these sentences in English, but an individual isn't a class of things. And so as a result, I don't have any way of taking advantage of my formal system to evaluate arguments containing singular propositions unless and until I can translate those singular propositions into classes of things. And that's what I need to do. When I have a singular proposition like Ted thinks it's a beautiful day, I need to introduce a phrase that picks out a class containing only Ted as a member. So I might use something like this: the person identical to And when I do that, then I pick out a universal quantifier and I say all people identical to Ted, picking out Ted now as the class containing only Ted, are people who think it's a beautiful day. Likewise, when I have an individual company, say like Twitter. Twitter is an abomination. Well, Twitter is an individual. If I want to include this in my categorical logic, I need again to modify the way I describe it so that I pick out a class containing only the company Twitter as its member. All companies identical to Twitter are abominations. In short, just as when I introduced noun phrases to convert subject or predicate terms that didn't actually pick out classes of things into subject or predicate terms that did, when I talk about an individual, I need to change the way I pick out that individual such that I pick that individual out in terms of a class containing only that individual as a member. And thereby I can now fold these kinds of sentences into my logic about classes and relationships between classes. Finally, I can look at cases where I've got adverbs and pronouns, and I want to convert those into times, places, people, or things. For example, suppose I have the sentence, everyone loves the Macarena. Well, everyone is both a non-standard quantifier and a means of picking out a class that doesn't make it explicit what the class is. And so I'll change those into explicit combinations of quantifiers and times, places, people, and or things. So all people, quantifier, subject term, picks out a class of things, are, fold that non-standard verb into the predicate class, people who love the Macarena, introducing that noun phrase again so that I have a predicate term that picks out a class of things. There's nowhere to hide from logic. Again, I've got a quantifier in there, I've got a quantity, and I know really the quantity of things that I'm supposed to be talking about, but I need to break it up so that I get no places are places to hide from logic. Adverbs and pronouns can cause difficulties in determining a correct standard form quantifier. And there are lots of regular non-standard form quantifiers out there in the English language and in other languages. Whenever I come across a quantifier that isn't all, no, or some, I need to try and figure out what the best translation into a standard form quantifier would be. For instance, many people like hockey. Many is not one of my standard form quantifiers, so I have to translate that statement into a statement that has a standard form quantifier. Based on the most probable interpretation, I'd probably go with some people are people who like hockey. All people are not hockey fans. Now here we've got a standard form quantifier, but it's paired with a non-standard copula. All and are not don't go together in any of our standard form categorical statements, and so we're going to have to reinterpret this sentence. It's actually ambiguous between no people are hockey fans and some people are not hockey fans. So based upon the best interpretation of that sentence, we'll probably go with some people are not hockey fans. Other sentences actually just don't have quantifiers, and so we need to add a quantifier based on our best understanding of what the person intends to say. For instance, suppose we have the sentence, computers are indispensable. We have to assign a quantity. How many computers are indispensable? All of them? None of them? Some of them. So we have to think about what makes the most sense. Now that 8086 that's collecting dust under your dad's bed, that probably is dispensable. So it's probably not going to be all computers are indispensable. So our best interpretation is probably going to be this. Some computers are indispensable things. Suppose we have the sentence, air guitars are not instruments. Again, we have to decide no, all, or some. All air guitars are not instruments is not a standard form categorical statement, so we would also have to change our copula. How about no air guitars are instruments? Well, that's the one that seems to make the most sense in the real world. How about some air guitars are not instruments? Well, there's really no basis for distinguishing between air guitars that are and air guitars that aren't instruments, so our best interpretation then will be no air guitars are instruments. In the next lecture module, we'll finish up with our translation heuristics, and we'll go through some practice problems in order to reinforce those heuristics while they're still fresh in our minds.